Hans Van Tilburg is the Maritime Heritage Coordinator for the Pacific Islands region with NOAA. Hans has previously presented to EAH, and two of those presentations can be viewed at EAH's YouTube channel Scottish Shipbuilding and Falls of Clyde and the Fate of the Shipwrecked USS Saginaw in 1870. His presentation at this meeting focuses on the history of diving. Hans has been a diver for over 50 years, and in this meeting, he covers his experiences, which range from sports scuba diving to commercial and scientific diving, including manned submersibles and remotely operated vehicles. He covers the earliest diving using just rock weights in the ancient world to the latest in closed-circuit rebreather diving. He covers the simplest, earliest diving that used inverted wooden wine barrels, the first diving bells, hard suits, and diving from saturation chambers. Email a comment at eahawaii@gmail.com or attend a meeting in person or via Zoom. Mahalo.
This presentation is really quite informal. It's more a matter of, personal remembrances and notes and my own biases, of course. I'm not here representing NOAA or speaking for NOAA on what we do as divers, but I will cover some of that. For a while, I was a sport diving instructor. And so I did some of that, and for a long while, I was an academic science diving instructor, and for a little while, I was a commercial diver in the Gulf of Mexico. So I can't really speak so much to the military history of diving, but I can speak to a few other things. Now, this is also another reason that when I was young, and I knew some other divers in the 60s, we all thought that, there was going to be a big future in underwater habitats, because we've been watching Jacques Cousteau, and we've been seeing, submersibles being built, and things like this were going on. The Sea Lab experiments, the Man in the Sea experiments, where the Navy worked out a lot of the logistics and physiological issues involved in what's called saturation diving. Remember, if you go underwater and you start to soak up nitrogen, it's generally to be avoided. But if you go to, say, 200 feet and stay there for 5 days, you've soaked up all you're going to soak up. So you're not incurring any more penalty. You can stay there forever. You just have to come up really slowly. So that type of saturation diving was investigated by the Navy, and actually John Craven was the civilian scientist in charge of the Man in the Sea program. He's a wonderful character, and he's quite involved in Hawaii as well. And there were a number of habitats being built, so it was really kind of an exciting future underwater that we sort of imagined back then. There were movies coming out like City Beneath the Sea, and there were all kinds of wonderful things going on. Barbara Eden was in some sort of big submarine going underwater. There was a voyage to the bottom of the sea, all kinds of things like that. There's only a few of these left, if not just one, the Aquarius, which still operates as an underwater habitat. This kind of imagined scientific future underwater, I think, sort of didn't all come about for a number of different reasons. The technological challenges, the nature of the ocean, the fuel crisis, the oil crisis in 1972, cost of energy, etc. There was even something planned for Penguin Banks off of Moloka'i. And I don't know many details about that, but I'd love to look into it as historic interest. It was never built. This is what Scripps have proposed for its underwater facility near Scripps Canyon in Southern California. And then Jacques Cousteau and Cousteau's image is his idea of underwater, that we're going to live underwater and we're going to stay. It's really not very easy at all, but it was imagined. Some of the submersibles that were built back then, they're only, out of the dozens that were built, there were only 3 or 4 that continued to work post-1972 into the 80s and 90s. On the upper right, that's, one of the Hurl subs. And those were 2 that we had here in Hawaii for a long time. They're no longer here, by the way. That was a NOAA and University of Hawaii, and then just a University of Hawaii program, the Hawaii Underwater Research Lab, with the Pisces submersibles. Those were working commercial submersibles they bought from the early 80s, or here for decades. And here I am living the dream. I was fortunate to get to work with the Hurl team and their pilots and their staff, and I got to go on enough missions where it became comfortable to just take a nap on the bottom of the ocean during the transit periods when the sub's getting from one point to the other. So I really appreciated that. That's a type of diving, and those are logged as dives. We're not under pressure. We're at 1 atmosphere within the sealed command sphere, behind 5 or 6 inches of steel, so we're fine. But the interesting thing is, we'd scrub our carbon dioxide out of that atmosphere in there, use soda sword, but we would metabolize a little bit of oxygen in that sphere. So after an 8-hour dive, we'd come back to the surface and go to open the hatch, and there'd be a little bit of negative pressure. There'd be less air inside that steel sphere than when we started because we metabolized about that much. Here's the Hurl submersible lifting off from their submersible platform, the pontoon platforms. Fantastic shot by Colin Wallerman. 3 people inside the command sphere. These are 11-ton subs. So it involved diving, and it involved divers in the water helping to launch these. Next slide.
How deep can that go?
The Pisces subs, I think, had 2,000 meters.
How deep is that right there?
Right here, it's going to be about 60, 80 feet.
To launch it?
Yeah.
Why do you need to have something to launch it at 60 feet?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a platform to deploy them. So they had a large vessel.
Yeah.
And the vessel was able to carry both subs on deck and then crane them out and drop them. But if you didn't want to pay the price of taking the whole ship out, you could tow a submersible pontoon out with 1 sub on it. And you could tow it behind a much smaller vessel.
And
then divers could sink that platform, and the sub could take off and do its
But you didn't need to go to 60 feet to launch it.
Well, you want to get away from the surface zone where there's any turbulence going on. I guess depending on the sea state. That's the inside of the command sphere and the small ports for observers, and Terry, senior pilot, is in the middle driving the sub.
Can't see a damn thing.
It's a little hard. They're high-resolution cameras on the outside, but it is a little difficult to look through those ports. We use them for a number of underwater archaeology missions. This is the tail of one of the Japanese 2-man subs. This is the one that was sunk by the Ward outside of Pearl Harbor. And so we did some surveying there. And they're fascinating jobs as well.
How deep was that miniature submarine out there?
Well, is that a classified document? Am I allowed to unclassify it?
We can declassify
About 1,200. Like 1,200 feet.
Looking behind me and the president.
Yeah. So really a lot of this kind of diving, rather than the recreational stuff, comes from the commercial world. And there's all kinds of actually really interesting work that's going on that I think most of the public is not always aware of. Dam construction, hull inspections, oil field diving, pipeline, sewers, bridges, salvage, minor assessments, police, fire, and rescue, etc. To do all that, this isn't something that scientists would afford, or the public. To do that commercial work, suits like this were involved. So rather than being inside a submersible or subjecting yourself to the pressures of the deep, you could have a 1-atmosphere suit. The design goes way back. It'd be pretty scary to climb in that thing from 1882. But the gym suit or the WASP suits, those are working commercial 1-atmosphere suits. Essentially 1-person submersibles with some mobility on the bottom. And, with greater depth capability, certainly than a diver in the open environment, hard suits. Having said that, I'm going to say, even though this was possibly the worst diving movie ever made, it has a wonderful scene where the gym suit is crunched in half by the underwater monster, and so of course we have to watch it. Most of the commercial work, probably isn't with those gym suits, but just divers. Surface supplied divers in what is the modern version now of the Mark V heavy gear. So this is lightweight gear. Scuba divers would look at this and say, that's not lightweight gear, not compared to scuba diving. But compared to the Mark V's, this is lightweight. Those are fiberglass helmets. And umbilical, with communications, hardwired communications to the surface, maybe a bailout bottle just in case something happens to the umbilical. The check valve, of course, the one-way valve, so if anything happens underwater, if that umbilical is cut, you're not going to be forced up into your own helmet. And this is the way a lot of divers in the oil field dive, from the surface, although sometimes they'll deploy to saturation systems. So what you see on the right is a bell mated onto a recompression chamber on the work platform. So the way saturation diving works is divers will deploy, they'll go into that chamber for maybe a period of 2 weeks, or however long the job is. They'll pressurize them to the pressure of the work site on the bottom. And to go to work, they climb in the bell is unmated, at pressure, drop down to the bottom, they open the hatch and they go out. Their umbilical comes out of the bell. They do their day's work, they climb back in the bell, go back up to the chamber at pressure and climb in. And they get paid every minute they're under pressure. It's a dive. They're diving 24 hours a day. There haven't been, well, I guess there are some long-term studies on what saturation diving does to you in terms of bone necrosis and physiology, but we don't need to get into the details of that. Let's just say it's not a huge body of data to understand what happens long-term. A lot of the systems are kind of commonly denoted by the type of hat. We had rat hats for oceaneering when I was diving in LA, and we were rat hat divers, and so we thought we were really pretty hot stuff because we couldn't afford the better helmet. So we thought that the rat hat helmet would be fine for us. It had no oral nasal inside the helmet, so if it flooded, you'd be kind of dealing with it right away. And on the surface, you can see the tenders, dive tenders at the surface, and the rack box for controlling pressure and communications on the dive. And the types of jobs are actually fascinating. This is kind of an oil field job, working on the jackets underwater, the stands for holding the platforms up, hydroblasting the corrosion or the growth, the biogrowth, the mussels on those rigs that create drag in the current and eventually so much weight that they become structurally less, compromised a bit, or construction underwater, or fixing a broken valve, or recovering a dropped piece of equipment. Pipeline work. Some of the big equipment on the bottom that digs the trenches and lays the pipes themselves, the cables, is automated, but to inspect that, to monitor that, divers are deployed. And sometimes they work inside the pipelines as well, inspecting the seams between joints, etc. So don't be claustrophobic, but there's a lot of this kind of work going on. You can see some modern versions of this in the Kirby Morgan Superlight 17B, which is what we all wanted when we had the rat hats. And especially we wanted a Kirby Morgan Superlight if we could paint flames on the outside of the fiberglass helmet. That'd be pretty cool. Wet welding is possible underwater. Cutting steel with broker rods, possible underwater. If you're wet welding underwater with the electric stick, it's going to have a lot of impurities in it, so it's not a great weld. So for pipelines and things, the commercial divers will construct a dry habitat, put it over the pipe, blow the water out of that box, then crawl inside and do dry welding inside that box. So it's welding. So it's not a fun job. I can tell you, even doing the wet welding underwater, water conducts electricity. You'll feel, if you have metal fillings in your mouth, you'll feel your whole mouth vibrating. We're in a pretty intense electrical field doing stuff like this, but it pays pretty well. It is hazardous. It's electricity and water. What is it with that? So rather than always subject divers to the hazards of some commercial jobs, the robots are doing more and more now these days. In terms of inspection, in terms of even manipulation with manipulators on larger ROVs or remotely operated vehicles. So these ROVs, these robots on a tether, they're all sizes and for all types of jobs, from the little accessible portable unit like this, not very powerful, but has a camera and a compass. You can kind of drive it around with a speed on the surface, the pilot is on the surface. Or a bigger 4-thruster Phantom ROV, or you can get rid of the tether altogether and program your robot to go into the ocean, descend to the bottom, and search for something in a search pattern until the battery gets low, it pops back up and signals you to come pick me up, and you download the data. It's an AUV, an autonomous underwater vehicle. Those aren't people diving, those are robots diving. This is our robot. This is the NOAA ship Okeanos Explorer. And we have a Deep Discoverer, which is on the right, hanging from the crane. If you're a Star Trek fan, if you've seen the board, you know that the cube station, this is kind of like a 12-foot high board ROV. But it deploys, it's a 2-part system. On the left on deck, you see Sirius, which is the power unit and the deployment unit for Deep Discoverer. So what happens is when the long cable goes out from the ship, carrying that high voltage down to the ROV, the robot, there's a lot of bounce in that cable. The Sirios on the left is the weight that holds that cable down. And from the Sirios is another cable that deploys to D2, Deep Discoverer 2. So the Sirios hangs over the work site, and the Deep Discoverer surveys and does the work on the bottom. So we have multiple camera images of our surveys with these NOAA robots. And this system is capable, I think, to about 18,000 feet. So there's D2 looking at the wing of a B-24 in the ocean off of Saipan, one that was involved in the bombing of Japan at the end of World War II, the horrific bombing that was involved. So that's fascinating. That's deep ocean work, but that's not what most marine scientists do. So we bravely go into the shallows as marine scientists. Budget is one factor, but actually a lot happens in the shallows of the ocean that we need to be aware of. So that's the other thing. So, most of the marine science I've been involved in for many years has been relatively shallow water diving, 120 feet, 130 feet max. Recently, we're going a little bit deeper, but there were all kinds of reasons for those limitations, because I'm not talking about sport diving now, I'm talking about diving as a profession. We all fell under the rules that came out of the 1970s from OSHA, called the commercial diving rules. OSHA wrote the rules for any situation where someone's being paid to dive. There's an employer-employee situation in federal waters. We abide by OSHA. And OSHA says if you're going to dive deeper than 120 feet, you're going to have a chamber on the surface ready to recompress someone. You're only going to be able to use nitrox as a gas. You can't use odd gases. You can't do this, you can't do that. If you do, you need like a whole huge dive platform. That's not feasible for universities. That's not feasible for diving instructors who are just teaching people how to dive. On scuba, so they got an exemption to the OSHA commercial regs. It's called the Scientific Diver Exemption. And that means when you're doing diving for science, you can be paid, but you're using your skills to do science underwater and not heavy work. So there's all kinds of nuance to this. You can use a screwdriver, but you can't lift that heavy thing over there because that doesn't take scientific expertise. So there's a gray zone, and we kind of bend it a little bit here and there. But that was a big, important evolution for the UC university system in California and for Scripps, because they couldn't do marine science unless they got an exemption to OSHA. That's what we abide by. If we're doing anything else, like we're diving under a NOAA ship to inspect the hull, we don't do it with the scientific exemption. We have to do it by the commercial diving regs. So scientific diving, for those reasons, is relatively lightweight, easier, fun. The tools are light. The tasks don't require a ton of pneumatic tools, etc. Coral reef survey, marine debris recovery, our archaeological work on the USS Arizona and other wrecks, etc. Those are all under the scientific exemption. We're using our science to study the natural world. I wouldn't say that open water scuba gear is all light. I mean, cold water environments demand, warm gear like these dry suits with lots of fleece underwear, lots of weight to compensate for the bigger displacement of water, 30, 40 pounds on the belt, and pulling all that on in cold environments on a small boat. We were so exhausted in this picture before we even got in the water. We were saying, let's just go back to the boat right now. It's hard. It's hard work, but that's open circuit scuba.
Where do you have the snorkel on the side?
Oh, it's a requirement.
That's a requirement.
It's a NOAA requirement to always have a snorkel. Snorkel on the left side. Regulator comes over the right side. We've been pushing beyond that and pushing the scientific exemption deeper and deeper in recent years because of what finally becomes available to scientists and now the public, the closed circuit rebreathers, right? So this is a type of technical diving. By technical diving, I mean not just air and not just going to 130 feet. Going beyond that, going into stage decompression, and using mixed gases. That's all possible under the scientific exemption now. But when you start doing that, it's no longer so easy. Look at the multiple tanks of gas this diver has, 2 on his back, 2 under his arms. Bailout tanks. If the system goes bad, he can bail out to another cylinder. Backup systems. Computers on the wrist. Multiple regulators if one fails or freezes up. There's another regulator to go to. It's technically more and more challenging, especially with these rebreathers. So this is really interesting because this is where we're going to kind of end up. The evolution of diving is with this closed circuit rebreather technology. And it's really something relatively recent. Of course, the military was doing it in the 30s. The scientists began really getting into it in the 60s and 70s. And one of them who really pushed and advanced this evolution is Rich Pyle, works for the Bishop Museum here in Hawaii. It's not surprising that Hawaii is on the cutting edge of some of this because of how much marine science we have going on underwater. And we have nice waters to dive in. So Rich Pyle is using the Cis-Lunar and then other systems as a rebreather system, closed circuit system, breathing out, scrubbing out the carbon dioxide with the soda sword, adding a little oxygen back into the loop. And since he's not blowing all that gas away in bubbles, instead of the big dive tank on his back, the tanks are small and they last hours and hours and hours. You can go deeper and deeper and deeper, right? Fascinating, but it's not like doing human experimentation was ever very easy. And when I went through the training for that type of rebreather, the Megalodon, I was impressed by the fact that a lot of the protocols that were invented to do closed circuit rebreather diving seem to be, this is my personal opinion, a couple guys in the garage saying, how do you feel? I feel okay. How do you feel? I'm okay. Well, that must have worked. Kind of trial and error. Don't hold me to that, but I remember thinking that quite often. Because there are inherent risks, higher risks in doing something like this. Okay, it's challenging. The gear is challenging. The computers needed are challenging. It all comes down to monitoring the amount of oxygen. Because if you're off a little bit, if you suddenly take a breath with too much oxygen in it, you could have convulsions underwater. And it does happen to even trained instructors. The risk is greater. It all comes down to these oxygen sensors. Triple redundancy. The idea is if one sensor is bad, the other 2 sensors vote it out and give you an accurate reading of the percentage of oxygen in your loop. But if 2 are bad, the good one gets voted out. There's the canister for the scrubber. There's the tanks for the diluent, the gases, breathing gases. You can see this is a lot more technically challenging and a lot more equipment, complex equipment, electronic equipment in a saltwater environment with batteries. So there is a higher level of risk. People are diving these systems down to 200, 300 feet, 400 feet, 500 feet. Cave divers use these systems. That's risky diving, very risky, but they're being used that way. And that's kind of the cutting edge of a diver in the environment, not sealed in a suit or a submersible. It's the cutting edge of where we're at now. I'm glad I got trained, but I'm not actively doing CCR diving anymore. It's easier for me to just jump in the water in my part of the career and just blow bubbles, which is relatively safe and very few things go wrong. But hats off to these deep technical divers. They're pressing the edge of the envelope. This just finally gives you an idea of what we're actually looking at in terms of diving. Sport diving and technical diving on the left, in the relative shallows. The manned submersibles like the Hurl subs down to 6,000 feet. ROVs down to around 18,000 feet. And then very specialized vehicles, the kinds of things you see in documentaries funded by very wealthy programs, down to the very bottoms of the trenches. We're still just diving in the very upper shallows. That's it. I don't know if this will ever happen, if it'll ever get easier to dive without all that equipment.
As the chair of the talks, thank Hans. And normally we'd give you a certificate of appreciation, but I have it on good authority that your wall is full of meritorious achievements And also, Sam's printer didn't work. So thank you very
No
much,
worries.
sir.
You're very welcome. It's a pleasure.
Engineers and architects of Hawaii welcome your comments on this program and any of our recent programs. We encourage your direct participation in this community outreach. So please email us your comments and ideas at eahawaii@gmail.com.